The year was 1888, one of the cruelest winters the Midwest had ever known. In a town where the cold judged no less harshly than the people, Grace Hamilton moved through life carrying more than just sacks of flour. She carried the weight of every whisper. Her days were spent stocking shelves at her father's trading post, her fingers red from the cold, her eyes lowered to avoid the stares. It wasn't her fault the store sold liquor. But to the townsfolk, that was enough. Not the kind of girl you bring home to mama, they'd say behind their mugs, voices cutting sharper than frost. That night, the storm raged louder than ever, winds shrieking through town. Inside, the laughter from the bar in the back stung more than usual. She needed air. She needed space. She stepped out into the snow and didn't look back. The further she walked, the more the world vanished in white. Her boots sank deep. Her cloak whipped wildly. She turned, but her footprints were gone. Then the ice cracked beneath her, thin, invisible beneath the snow. She fell hard, pain shooting through her ankle. She tried to rise, but her body was done. She collapsed, cold, broken, alone. Far from town, Caleb Mason heard something over the howl of the wind, a cry, faint but real. Lantern in hand, he stepped into the storm. And there she was, crumpled in the snow, barely breathing. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't hesitate. He lifted her, her body heavy and limp in his arms. With each step back toward his cabin, the wind clawed at him, but he didn't stop. Inside the warmth of Caleb's cabin, the storm raged against the walls like a beast scratching to be let in. Grace lay wrapped in heavy wool blankets, her breath shallow but steady, skin pale against the firelight. Caleb moved quietly, checking the fire, then kneeling beside her to offer a mug of steaming water. "You're lucky I found you," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Grace tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't let her. Where am I?" she whispered. "My cabin," Caleb replied. "You were half dead in the snow." The words settled heavy in the room. Grace glanced at her surroundings, rough-hewn logs, shelves of tools and preserved food, and a single bed with folded linens. She was alone, in a man's cabin, unchaperoned, and in a town like hers, that alone was enough to ruin a woman. "I need to leave," she said suddenly, trying again to rise. "Not in this storm," Caleb replied, steady. "You wouldn't make it a mile." The silence that followed was thick. Grace looked at the snow still piling outside the frosted window, her mind racing with shame and fear. "Thank you," she said at last, her voice barely a whisper. Caleb gave a single nod. "Rest. You'll need your strength." As the night wore on, Caleb sat in the shadows, eyes flicking now and then to the woman resting near the fire. He didn't know her name. He hadn't asked. But something about her stirred a long, dormant ache in his chest. The memory of warmth, of care, of the life he once lost. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure he wanted to be alone. By the time the storm cleared, Grace was strong enough to stand, though the cold still clung to her bones. Caleb insisted on walking her back. He didn't speak much, just adjusted his rifle and nodded toward the trail. They walked in silence, boots crunching in deep snow, breath fogging the air. When they reached town, the world did not welcome her. A single look, and the whispers bloomed like frost across every window. "She stayed with him," someone muttered. "Alone?" Grace's father stood behind the counter of the trading post, his jaw clenched so tight it trembled. "Do you have any idea what this has done?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. She opened her mouth, ready to explain, but it didn't matter. It never had. People will believe what they want to believe. Caleb said nothing but stayed at her side, still and unreadable. Her father's eyes scanned the man who had saved his daughter, his judgment hanging in the air like smoke. "What kind of man lets this happen?" he asked, bitterness rising. Caleb's voice was quiet. "The kind who kept her alive." The silence that followed felt colder than any storm. Grace looked around, her shame heavy, her spine straight. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to vanish. Her father exhaled, long and slow, and spoke the words like a final sentence. "There's only one way to fix this. You two need to marry." The word cracked through the room like ice breaking on the river. Marriage. Grace's heart sank. Not because Caleb had been cruel. He hadn't. But this wasn't a dream. This was a consequence. Caleb turned to her, calm and certain. "If it'll save your name," he said, "we'll do it." And just like that, it was done. The wedding came quickly. There were no flowers, no lace, no laughter. Just a drafty wooden church, a preacher with tired eyes, and a handful of townsfolk more curious than kind. She wore a borrowed dress that pinched at the waist and didn't quite reach her ankles. He wore a suit that smelled faintly of smoke and mothballs. The air inside the church was colder than it should have been. The preacher spoke the words slowly, as if even he doubted their weight. When it was time to say, "I do," neither voice trembled, but neither voice soared either. They weren't two hearts joining out of love. They were two reputations being salvaged. Outside, snowflakes danced silently as they stepped into a world unchanged. No cheers, no kisses, just murmurs and turned backs. They walked side by side to the edge of town. Their hands didn't touch. The cabin, when they returned, felt smaller than before. Quieter, more fragile. The fire still burned, but it no longer felt like a refuge. They fell into a rhythm that didn't feel like life, but like endurance. He chopped wood and repaired the roof. She mended clothes and wiped down the table until the wood lost its grain. They spoke little, ate in silence, slept on opposite sides of the bed. And yet, there were moments. She found a handmade wooden comb left beside her bowl one morning. She didn't ask. He found his socks mended with invisible stitches. He didn't comment. Sometimes she caught him watching her, not like a husband, like a man trying to understand a stranger in his house. Sometimes she watched him too, not like a wife, like someone trying to remember what safety looked like. And in those quiet hours between chores and silence, something unspoken began to settle between them. Not love, not yet, but something steadier than resentment, something warmer than obligation. Spring did not come all at once. It came in drips and glimmers. A patch of thawed earth beneath the pine, a trickle of water singing beneath the ice, and one morning the sound of birdsong through the crack in the cabin wall. Grace rose early, her feet bare on the cold wood floor. She lit the stove, folded their worn linens, and stepped outside into the stillness. The snow was retreating, leaving behind damp soil and tiny green shoots. Caleb joined her with 2 mugs in hand. They stood together without speaking, steam curling from the cups. For once, the silence wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. In the days that followed, something shifted. She planted a row of onions and marigolds along the cabin's edge. He built her a bench from leftover planks. They shared more words, not many, but honest ones. Sometimes he watched her laugh with her head tilted back, and something inside him softened. Sometimes she watched him fix the fence and felt something anchor in her chest. They weren't in love, not yet, but they were no longer strangers surviving under the same roof. They were 2 lives gently moving toward one another, like rivers bending with time. One warm evening, as fireflies blinked over the field, Caleb handed her a pouch. Inside was a small silver brooch, tarnished but elegant. "It was my mother," he said. "She wore it every Sunday. Thought maybe you'd like it." Grace looked at him, unsure of what to say. She hadn't worn anything fine in years. She pinned it to her shawl the next morning. He noticed, but said nothing, just smiled, small and real. And so they continued. With each shared meal, each repaired roof tile, each quiet walk through the clearing, something tender grew between them. Not rushed, not perfect, but rooted. And sometimes that's all love needs. Not fireworks, not poetry, just 2 people choosing kindness, again and again, even when they weren't asked to. And so ends the story of Grace Hamilton. A woman judged too quickly and loved too slowly, who found not the life she expected, but the one she built with quiet courage. Because sometimes love isn't loud. Sometimes it's built from silence, from weathered hands, and from choosing someone even when the world is watching. If this story moved you, stick around. There are many more to tell. Stories of strength, hope, and the quiet kind of love that changes everything. Subscribe and join us for the next journey.